Our speaker today is Chris Law, President and owner of Accessibility Track Consulting, LLC, a company that provides consulting services to federal government and industry clients on their organizational responses to accessibility issues. Chris was part of the team that developed online training for the Interagency Trusted Tester program at the Department of Homeland Security, spearheading the project to assist federal partners in their organization-wide implementation of the Trusted Tester approach. His doctoral thesis was on business responses to accessibility, in which he revealed success factors for integrated organizational-wide approaches. Chris has over 20 years of experience in universal design and accessibility, including industry consulting, university-based R&D, and Section 508 programs within the U.S. federal government. He has participated in standards committees for electronic documents, self-service transaction machines, and telecommunications. Chris holds a PhD in business from RMIT University, an MSc in industrial engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a BSc in ergonomics from Loughborough University. We are delighted to have Chris with us this morning. I will now turn it over to him to start things off.
Thank you, Natalie. You can hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you fine.
Very good. So the outline of my talk is here. Organizational-wide approaches to accessibility I'm going to touch on briefly before going into the meat of the presentation, which is about resistance, planning ahead, and staying on track. And then as a wrap-up, talk about making accessibility a shared responsibility. So first topic, organization-wide approaches to accessibility. On the slide here, and I'm going to describe all the slides for people who are unable to see the slides. So on the slide here, we've got a figure where someone is pointing at an organizational hierarchy chart, and the accessibility team is highlighted, and they're saying, let's focus our changes here. And the audience member is saying, wait, what? This is actually based off of the experience. For example, consultants who are hired by an accessibility team to come in and rewrite their policy around accessibility, and then, you know, a year later, it turns out that nothing is actually being changed, nothing is actually being implemented, or a company that has been sued for the accessibility of their website, and so the accessibility team works to fix the website. They work with programmers to fix the website. It gets fixed, but again, a year later, the website is back to the way that it used to be, and that's because the culture of programming didn't change, because things started to creep in. So what's been happening in the last 5 years or so is that people have started focusing on organization-wide accessibility initiatives, with the idea that the accessibility of the final product really depends on much more than just what the accessibility team is doing. All departments, from marketing to customer service, get involved, and they impact the accessibility of the product. So in this diagram, I've got the same sort of illustration, but now the presenter is saying, let's focus our changes here, and it's circling the entire organization, and the audience member saying, well, right on. Okay. So this is the current frontier in the accessibility field, I think. The people are realizing that the technical issues are not that difficult to solve, in that there's a lot of people working on them. You can Google the answers to most of the technical issues, or you can hire a consultant to come and help you out with your technical issues. It's cross-organizational implementation, where it's a fairly new area, and this is where the frontier of knowledge is, and this is where this is the sort of area that I reside in. Okay. Now, on this illustration, I would say it may be a precursor to get your accessibility team on board first and get them singing from the same song sheet before you do the organization-wide approach. But really, the focus has to be on organization-wide things to bring about real change in the way that products and services are made accessible. So the first of two quick polls. We want to find out, have you started or attempted an accessibility project that would have impact outside of the organization's accessibility team? So for example, you've been pulled in to help the team, or you're working within the team. And have you, we're not talking about resistance just yet, we're just talking about, have you tried a project that goes outside of your team? And so the possible answers are no, I haven't, yes, once or twice, yes, quite a few times, or yes, many times. And I think Natalie is going to run the poll. Give you a few minutes to answer. Like me, you may be wondering why Blackboard uses such tiny fonts. Well, it's not Blackboard this time, it's Adobe. It's Adobe Connect. Sorry, Blackboard. So yeah, we've got a lot of people that are have done this many times. That's good. That's a new trend in the field. People doing this type of activity. So that's good. So you've got some experience probably coming into this with encountering resistance, but we're going to have a poll on resistance and whether you encountered it in yours. But generally, people are trying to do these type of things, and that's probably why you tuned in today. So that's great. Let's move on. So, excuse me. So the this slide looks daunting at first, but it's I'll talk you through it. It is in the last 5 years or so, a number of publications and resources have been developed on organization-wide change for accessibility. So I'm listing a sampling of those here. I'm going to be sending out tomorrow. I'll send out a sort of reading list that includes all of these. So don't worry about the content too much for now. But these are resources that are being produced for tackling organization-wide accessibility changes. The first three, I'll just mention, are things that I've been involved with. The first is my PhD thesis, which was responding to accessibility issues in business. That's published online. Then there's the Unified Testing for Accessibility project, and that's an activity that I did while I was at Department of Homeland Security on helping other federal agencies adopt a new test process, trusted test process, and helping coaching those people through the process. And it turned into quite a large-scale organizational change effort. And the third item is a webinar that we did actually this month, myself and Jeff Klein, who's author of the first book on the second row. And that is on starting or revamping an accessibility program in an organization. We did that with Georgia Tech. So in each of these types of resources, there's sort of step-by-step guidance on how to go through your project in order to make organizational change. So these are here for reference. So on to the second poll. So now, for those of you who answered yes, and I think it was most of you, on the previous poll, did you encounter resistance that significantly impacted the success of the project? So your choices are no, I encountered no resistance, or yes, it was minor and easily overcome, or yes, it was significant but it had a positive impact, or yes, and it had a significant negative impact on the project. So I'll give you a few minutes to respond to that. So we're getting a few answers here, and on the whole, it seems like people are having a positive impact, and that's really a good thing. And encountering that resistance and dealing with it, a lot of us have to sort of figure this stuff out on the fly, and we've done that in the past. But collecting that knowledge together, there really needs to be some sort of book on this. So there really, but there isn't right now. And those books and resources that I just mentioned, they may deal with the issue of resistance in like a paragraph or a page, but they don't really have time or the bandwidth to sort of go into it in depth. So even in those resources, they're a good starting point, but they don't give you the sort of topic area overview of, okay, what are you going to do to encounter resistance? And for those of you who responded it had a negative impact, I'm hoping today that we can learn about things that will turn it into a more of a positive or even reduction of resistance so that the project can go a lot more smoothly. Okay, so back to the presentation. In any situation, you're going to deal with people in organizational teams, and what I've got represented here is pockets of resistance. So you may have small teams of folks who are completely on your side. They're on board with the project. And you may have whole teams of people who are against you, working against the ideas that you're putting forward. And you may have large teams where mostly everybody's on board and maybe one or two people are having problems. So I think we've all encountered situations like this, where we've got to look at the different components that we're dealing with and tackle them differently based on the reactions that people are giving us. And on this slide, I've got a picture of a swimming pool with lots of different swim lanes here. And I believe you can't really focus and succeed on organizational change without really understanding and solving issues that are outside of the accessibility field. Okay, so we may be experts in accessibility, but what do we know about business, organizational behavior, psychology, change management, and resistance/motivation? We may know a little bit. Personal experience is going to give us some of this and some of the training, and maybe we took a few classes in this back in university. But on a day-to-day basis, we tend to sort of live in the accessibility swim lane, but really we've got to get out of the accessibility swim lane and look at these other areas. So this talk is based on experience outside of accessibility from my own personal experience and from talking with colleagues about these other types of issues. And on the next slide, I'm introducing just 4 books that I'm using as sort of starting points here that I used for my presentation. These are all books that come from outside of the accessibility field. So the first book is Process Consulting by Alan Weiss, that's from 2002. Then we've got Linchpin by Seth Godin from 2010. We've got The Inmates Are Running the Asylum by Alan Cooper from 1999. And The First 90 Days by Michael Watkins, and that's from 2003. So, again, this will be on the reading list that I send out tomorrow. So these types of books, they're not from the accessibility field, as I mentioned, but these are the types of books where I've gotten my resources and guidance on how to deal with some of these issues of resistance. So in the next section, I will be pulling out quotes from some of these books as examples, and I've put in reference page numbers for anybody who does want to go look these things up in more detail later on. So the main topic, the main area of this talk is planning ahead and staying on track when it comes to resistance. So I'm going to go over 8 different areas that I've picked out. The first of these is called the ambiguous zone. So this is a quote from Alan Weiss. He says, "Eschew the myth that people are reluctant to change. People are quite resilient and actually quite adept at change." So what does he mean? He means that change is going on all the time. You know, if we think about our route to work is blocked by construction, we have to change our route to work. That's change. New people get employed. The company gets taken over. Change happens all the time, and people really do get through it. He says, instead, what people do tend to resist is ambiguity. Okay? So what does this mean? He talks about the difference between the current state and the desired state and what you need to go through to get there, which he calls the ambiguous zone. So in this diagram, the current state is kind of clear. Everybody knows it. Not everybody may be comfortable with it, but everybody pretty much knows what the current state of being is in the organization. The desired state, he says it's really not hard to paint a picture for people of a better way to be and get agreement on that. But the ambiguous zone is the intimidating journey where people have a hard time. And so he uses the wonky lines to illustrate this in his figure. He's saying that you really need to be quite flexible in your approach because you come in with a flawless structure for your project and a rigid order, you're very unlikely to succeed because you're going to come up against this ambiguity. So let's think about this. I mean, in your personal life, you deal with ambiguity the same as you do in work life. You know, if you think of pretty much any situation. So I think of, okay, if I need to buy a gift for my wife's anniversary, I can think, well, my current state, I have no gift. My desired state, I need to have a gift ready that I think she's going to love. Now, the ambiguous zone is all that sort of back and forth questioning. You know, do I go for A, B, or C? I maybe go by A, and then I think it's wrong, and there's something wrong with it. I send it back, and those types of things. So that journey between knowing what you have now, knowing what you want, and then going through the process. Now, the only difference is sort of scale. If you think about your work projects, you might have a small work project or you might have a big multinational work project. You still have to go from a current state to a desired state, and you have to go through this zone. Okay? So that's the area where most of the resistance is going to happen. So the only real way to deal with that is to reduce your ambiguity. Now, this quote comes actually from a paper by Lichtenstein and Fischoff from 1977. It says people are more miscalibrated when they face difficult tasks, ones for which they fail to possess the requisite knowledge, than they are for easy tasks, ones for which that they do possess that knowledge. So what does this mean? We know coming in that accessibility knowledge usually isn't very widespread in organizations. You'll talk to people and they've never heard about accessibility. It may be that we're 15 years after Section 508 and 25 years after the ADA, but still you will talk to programmers who have never heard of accessibility and never been required to. And those folks are going to be miscalibrated. They're going to assume that this is a difficult area, otherwise why weren't they doing this before? So if that's the case, it's incumbent on us to provide that education. The only way that we can reduce education for people who are miscalibrated is to provide education. You can't address the lack of knowledge by anything other than providing more knowledge. So reducing ambiguity requires discussion with and education of stakeholders throughout a project. That's the basic message there. The next topic area is transition traps. And The quote here is from the book, The First 90 Days by Michael Watkins. He says, so if you habitually find yourself too anxious or too busy to devote time to learning, you may suffer from the action imperative. It is a serious affliction because often being too busy to learn results in a death spiral. So for our purposes, this applies to two main areas. The first area is the academic, and that is learning about the types of issues to expect, how to deal with them. Reading books such as this and others, reading resource websites, learning about resistance, learning about the way that the organization works. And then there's from learning about the way the organization works from what's printed, what's written down in policy, what's on the websites. But then there is the practical, and that is learning about the actual environment that you're going into. And that's just as important, finding out how things actually work. And we'll return to this issue of finding out how things actually work in the next few topic areas. So the academic learning is a really good primer and a good source of analysis for the practical learning, but both are equally important. Watkins also talks about this issue of these transition traps. He says that in transition, you're informed by the things that you learned in the school of hard knocks. So you remember that I mentioned that the resources in our accessibility field don't really deal with this area. So you've got to look outside of your area for inspiration and knowledge. But if you don't look outside that area for inspiration and knowledge, you're going to generally repeat what you know, what has worked in previous situations. So you might do things like set unrealistic expectations. That you may come in and say, look, 100% of all of our projects are going to be completely accessible across the entire 50,000 person operation here. That's kind of unrealistic coming in. So setting realistic expectations means dealing one-on-one with the folks that are implementing this project and finding out, well, okay, what can we achieve in what time frame? That's also closely related to attempting to do too much and then being disappointed when you can't do all those things. Also coming in with the answer. You may have had a project that worked in company A, you go into company B, it's a completely different culture. That answer does not work. Engaging in the wrong type of learning. For example, you should have learned A, B, and C. Instead, you went off and learned D, E, and F. You really do have to spend time, he says, actively finding out what it is that you're supposed to learn in the situation that you're going into. Okay. Neglecting horizontal relationships, that is spending time talking to the executives and what they want, talking to the subordinates and giving them instructions on what they should do, and then neglecting talking to peers who have quite a lot of information about how things actually work at the time. And the last one I just italicized because that was on the previous slide, falling prey to the action imperative, that is seemingly to want to do something straight away. He's cautioning, look, you've got 90 days, but you don't have to start with action on day one on this. So his book, The First 90 Days, it's really sort of focused on people who are changing jobs, people who are being promoted, but it applies equally to starting a new initiative up in an organization. So avoiding the transition traps here, the quote is, the actions you take during the first few months in a new role will largely determine whether you succeed or fail. And he's basically saying, look, if you don't get it within 90 days, the people around you are going to lose their respect, lose their trust that your job is going to work for them. And so it's a really critical period, especially if you're coming in and presenting a project that may take 1 to 2 years. What happens in that first 90 days is vital. And avoiding such transition traps and knowing what they could be is also vital. So the next section, section 3, is what it's like from the client's point of view. This, going back to the book by Weiss, is a quote where he says, this is talking from the client's point of view, if change is in my best interest, I will help lead it. If I perceive change not to be in my best interest, I will ignore it. If I think change is against my interest, then I'll fight it. Okay, so he's saying that the impetus for change is not so important. You know, you may be dealing with a crisis. You may be just dealing with incremental improvement. He says it doesn't really matter. What is important is the relative importance that's placed on this change according to the interests of the recipient of the change. So what does this mean? He says, look, substantive change is created by affecting the belief systems of key people. And then he says, people change only through 3 factors, and 2 of them don't work. So he lists power and normative peer pressure, and those are crossed out because he's saying that they don't work. And then the third one he asserts does work, rational self-interest. So the first one, power. Power is using orders, threats, ridicule, these types of things. We've all seen it in our work, where you get temporary movement from your staff, from your colleagues, but you don't really get commitment or motivation in those. Then you've got peer pressure. You need to be part of the team. You need to come along with me, and you need to come along with me on this journey. And this might be perceived by the recipient as, come along on this journey and be a lemming like us and jump off a cliff. You don't know what that perception is, and they may be sitting there poker-faced, and you really don't know what it is. You might get short-lived compliance here, but no real commitment. Instead, what he says is the thing that really motivates people to change and to come along on the journey is rational self-interest. So things like improvement, fulfillment, learning, intrinsic motivation rather than external poking. Now, again, think about accessibility. How do you get accessibility to be in everybody's rational self-interest? And by everyone, I mean all the people in the different departments in the organization that impact your products and services and the accessibility of those. How do you do that? So we're going to return to that in part 3 of the talk. But in terms of, well, what's the solution here on this issue of enlightened self-interest? It's basically to keep an eye on it and keep returning to it. So here I've got an image of someone carrying the flag and saying, everybody follow me. Those are the people who are going to help lead it. Well, there's also going to be people who are ignoring it and fighting it. And if you're getting people who are ignoring it and fighting it, your only recourse really is to go back to your plan of action and remediate it and figure out a different way of approaching this this topic with these folks and finding out how you can return it into their self-interest. Number 4 is change makers, parentheses, and it's not you. So your job as a consultant in this process is to coach the people that are there to do their own process. That is, if the client wants this thing to stick, if they want it to succeed in the long run, it really has to be their project. So this is again by Weiss. He says, you, as a consultant, are not the change agent, no matter what they're paying you. And he's saying that the people who are there, those are the ones who are having to make the change. You're just there to help them along with the process. So he says that you need to talk in terms of we have a problem, not I have a problem. He gives examples where he's brought into an organization to change things, to help change things, and somebody stands up in a meeting and says, look, Mr. Weiss, you've been here for a month and nothing's changed. You're not doing a good job. And he says, wait a minute. We are not doing a good job. I've been brought in by this part of the group to help you achieve some sort of change. I don't need to make the change. I'm a separate consultant. We all need to make the change in order to make this succeed. So we need everybody on board. You can't poke it back at the consultant and say that they're a change, that they are the change agent. And if they come in expressing that they are the change agent, you're really sort of setting yourself up for disaster, is the assertion that he's having here. So he says that people are concerned about various changes that might happen and these ambiguities that are creeping in. And these changes may not even be on your radar when you're setting up this project. So he says, look, assume the worst and prepare for it. Sometimes the consultant is the first person who will, in quotes, listen to the rebels. So those groups where maybe they are looking at changing accounting that comes along with adopting accessibility. And they may be saying, well, maybe this affects my reward system. Well, that's important to them. Maybe this is going to affect my bonus. This is going to affect my performance review. People have vested interest in those types of things. So I've been in situations where we've been writing policies, and the unions have to agree on it, and the unions are perceiving that this will be extra work, and how dare you put extra work on us, that sort of thing. So there's various vested interests that may not be on your radar. And for anybody who's, I've just worked, let me just say I've just worked for 5 years within the federal government, and I've seen a lot of lethargy, inertia, and stuff. So Weiss talks about that type of thing that's going on. Not everybody is going to rally around your flag because not everyone's there ready to work in some situations. So you've still got to deal with those types of things and be prepared for those. Trying not to disparage the federal government too much. There's a lot of good work goes on, but that sort of thing happens. Anyone who's worked in the federal space may agree. Anyway, so what can we do? We can coach the change makers. First, we've got to help them know what they're dealing with, because look, if they want to introduce change into a system that they don't understand, what's the likelihood that that's going to happen? What people talk in terms of knee-jerk reactions are saying, well, this is how it works here. You might find out, and you may help them find out, that that's not the way that things actually work here. Many times when you're interviewing people, you're going to find out things that contradict what other people have said. So if not everybody is on board and has a good general level of understanding of this system, and you're now going to introduce change into it, you've got different opinions, different takes on how the system works, and now you're going to enter into an ambiguous zone with them. So you want to reduce that by helping those change makers within the organization know exactly what they're dealing with by interviewing folks, and I'll talk a bit more about this in the next section as well. But basically, yeah, not coming in with the answers is the key thing here, because no one really wants to hear from outside, from the external source, exactly what's wrong and what they've been unable to figure out by themselves for a long time, and then the superhero consultant comes in with the rescue. That doesn't play out very well, is basically what he's saying. You need to come in more open and as a helper in the system rather than a savior of the system, if that makes sense. So then, number 5 here is what people say isn't necessarily what they do. So here, we're looking at organizational culture. What is culture? Culture is basically what people say and what people do. So Alan Weiss, again, he makes this point that you can have all the posters and motivational banners in the cafeteria that you like, but if they don't match what people say and do, they're pretty much worthless. So here I've got a typical type of motivational poster that we see around so many organizations, and the caption says, teamwork, coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, working together is a success. And it's a picture of like the Blue Angels flight team flying in formation of the air display. Now, you can imagine a situation where a manager puts this up and then goes around berating various team members behind their backs, doesn't provide training, doesn't provide additional resources, withholds useful information to team members that he has a personal dispute with, things like that. Now, what do you think people are more inclined to believe? Is it what they see as the manager's behavior, or is it the motivational poster? Because what they say isn't necessarily what they do, and that's an important distinction. In terms of finding out what is actually happening, this illustration from his book is also quite pertinent. It's talking about the differences between teams and committees. So a team, the word team is used quite a lot. He's saying, look, a team succeeds or fails together, okay? So we've got a whole group working towards one goal. If they get to that goal together, they all get the praise, or they all get the demerits if it doesn't succeed. Whereas a committee is a set of individuals who are working towards a goal. Everybody kind of knows what the goal is, but everybody's got slightly different agendas. They're going in slightly different directions. Some may get there first, and others don't. People are rewarded separately. And is this a team or is this a committee? He's saying that very often it's written as team, but it's actually committee. So this quote is kind of, this extra missive is, there's no I in team, but if you look hard enough, you're really going to find me, okay? This rings true if you have a committee that calls itself a team, okay? So it's important, again, there's a difference between what is being said, i.e. we're a team, and what people actually do, and that is we're really a committee, okay? And you've got to understand what is actually going on. You can't take it on face value of what is said is actually the truth, okay? Come back to truth again in a little while as well. We've got to really examine both aspects of the culture. We've got to examine what people say, what people do. And so here I have the alternate kind of poster. It looks very much like the motivational poster, but this is one of the demotivators that come out of despair.com. And here we have a picture of people whitewater rafting, and they've crashed into a rock and they're about to sink, basically. And the caption says, team building, sometimes the most important lesson you can learn is that you're not a very good team. Okay, so it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but the point here is this may be actually what's going on versus what is on the organizational chart. Okay. All right, moving on. The next thing we're going to focus on work by Alan Cooper here in his book, which is called The Inmates Are Running the Asylum. And the question for number 6 here is who's in control? And it may not be who you think. So here's the quote from Cooper. If you want to change some existing code, you will first have to change the programmer's mind. He will have a vested interest both in the existing code and in avoiding the seemingly unnecessary effort in changing it. So he gives examples in his book of where the CEO was not in fact in charge of his own organization, that it was really the programmers who made the key decisions. He's saying that the programmers can wield their power through denial or acceptance of your request. Because the programmers are the only ones who change the code of the product, and the code of the product determines how it actually works and whether it succeeds. They're the only ones who touch it, so there's quite a lot of power in there, and people use that power. Well, how do they do that? There's a quote here. I'm going to read through it first and then unpack it. The quote says, "Programmers are in control. They are the ones who establish how long it will take to implement each item, so they can force things to the bottom of the list by estimating them long. The programmers will, in self-defense, assign longer duration to the more nebulously defined items, typically those concerned with substantive user interface issues." So, unpacking this here. Programmers are the only ones who change the code, therefore they have a high degree of control over how the product behaves. So if something is nebulous, that is hard to measure, and Cooper is coming into this from the area of user interface design and usability, which is nebulous and hard to measure. And accessibility is the same, has had the same type of issue for a long time. It's been kind of hard to measure. It's been done by separate teams than the programmers, using things like JAWS and screen magnifiers and things like this, but by specialists. So it's kind of nebulous, and it's been hard to measure. Although that is changing, but people are coming up with more rigid measures for accessibility, but that's a different topic and a different presentation altogether. So in their self-defense, what they're doing is they're saying, those things that I don't understand, those things that I think are ambiguous, I'm going to put to the bottom of my list. And so they're reducing their ambiguity as they go forward. And how many times have we heard about projects where the programmers say in the meeting just before the product is to go live, well, yeah, we just didn't get to that. We didn't get to those issues. Maybe for the next version we can do some updates, but not for this version, sorry. And although this book is from 1999, things have improved since then. But if you if you have situations where this type of thing is not understood and it goes unchecked, then you're going to end up with problems in trying to implement what you want to see achieved, which is the accessibility changes. And as a side note here, it's a great book to, and it's a very funny book in trying to understand these sort of cultures. He had this great illustration of programmers acting like jocks. Now, what does this illustration mean? He's saying that in high school, the jocks use their physical power over the nerds in order to get them to do what they want them to do. And he says that, look, when you go into the business world, you can't use physical power. You're going to be thrown in jail if you start using your physical power at work. But your mental power, completely different. When you have the knowledge and the understanding and the control over the product, you can wield that power. So in this illustration, the archetypal nerd with the glasses and the pocket protector is whipping his towel at the athlete who's running out of the room. And he's saying, look, this actually happens if unchecked. and when people can use power, they do use power. That's basically the point of that. And it's really to understand this one subculture of programmers. It's really just an illustration, but there's other subcultures out there too. For example, human resources. I think people would agree that they have a subculture of their own. Marketing and customer support. These have subcultures as well. So this is really just an illustration of one which I think is probably the most important because, again, it affects whether the programming gets into the product. The main goal of what you want to achieve is better accessibility. Well, it's got to go through the people who are going to put the code in there. So he talks about, he gives an example of a couple that went to retire from America. They went to Mexico, and they were going to retire. And so they came up with plans for their dream home, which had 3 big windows in the front of the house, and they were specified as high-end windows of a certain design. 3 months later, they go to see how the project is coming along, and they're horrified to see that there's only 2 windows in the front, and they're a cheap design, nothing like they specified. And the developer says, this is a guide. You want windows in the front? There's windows in the front. What does it matter whether there's 2 or 3? And what does it matter? These are functional windows. These are just fine. And so in this situation, a set of specifications has been turned into a wish list. And Cooper is saying, look, the same thing happens with programmers. You can specify that the interface will work with a mouse and with a keyboard, but that's really a wish list. Ours works with the mouse. What do you mean? What do you mean it really had to do this? It just seemed like, so that sort of thing goes on. He talks about reusing code and how this trumps specification. He's saying, say a programmer has spent the last 2 years designing an interface, and then somebody comes along and says, well, it needs to be changed to make it accessible. Well, he's got a vested interest in that 2 years that he sat there working on that code. And, reusing code that's already made in their minds may trump your specification. And he talks about issues of cultural isolation. He talks about how the programming team are typically immune from dealing with customers because that's what technical support is for. And so they don't get to see people struggling. They don't see people who are blind struggling to use an interface or even not using their interface at all because they can't. So there's that immunity. In my experience, programmers and usability tend to just don't mix. There are, of course, exceptions. And he says that also the important point is skin in the game. The people who write the code are the only ones who read the code. To everybody else, it seems invisible. It's just reported out in meetings. Yes, we changed the code, and look, here, it works this way now. So it's very hard to actually get to the source of real issues if you don't have what they call skin in the game. Okay, moving on. 7. This is from Seth Godin's book, Linchpin. He's talking about learning about resistance and then getting the product out of the door. And he says, he uses this quote, real artists ship. And he's talking about resistance and understanding resistance and how to be a change agent by overcoming the resistance in yourself and overcoming the resistance in those around you. So we've got a Venn diagram here. It says, it's got 3 circles. It says could have, would have, should have. And in the intersection of that, we've got didn't. We didn't ship. So he talks about the amygdala, that area of your brain that is the oldest part of your brain and therefore shared with like the lower life forms like lizards, to use the term, the lizard brain. That area of your brain that only deals with fight or flight. And it's the first junction point of a question. Does this response or this issue that's come up require fight or flight? And getting past that area up to your higher functions of creativity, that's the problem. So on this next diagram, we've got those two things that are fighting with each other illustrated. So on the first Venn diagram, we've got dignity, generosity, and humanity, and at the intersection of those is the word indispensable. Whereas the other diagrams has conformity, compliance, and obedience, and the intersection of those is surrender. So what he's saying is that this fight between the creative urge and the fight or flight response is going on all the time. It's going on in all the people around you, and it's going on in yourself as you deal with things. The message is, don't surrender when people tell you that the project is doomed to fail. Instead, become indispensable and use your humanity, use your dignity, use your generosity to bring people around. But how many projects really don't ship on time? Probably the majority of projects don't ship on time. So let's take this knowledge, goes and says, and then apply it in the real world of shipping. We need to overcome resistance. And so he says, well, how do we overcome this and learn how to ship much faster? He says that in column 1 here, he says there's a thing called thrashing that happens. Thrashing is the apparently productive brainstorming and tweaking that we do for a project as it develops. And in the typical amateur project, all the thrashing is near the end. So thrashing early would be brainstorming with the team and overcoming the challenges and the differences of opinion, whereas thrashing late, there's more people involved, there's more meetings, and it's a sort of crisis mentality. Well, why don't people thrash early? It means meeting your resistance head-on early, where people have this choice at the beginning of projects. Do I start fighting with the programmers now, or do I go and hide? And then we'll just get to that later. Typically, the resistance succeeds, and you end up with this bigger problem later on, which is coordination. Coordination is coordinating teams of people becomes exponentially more difficult as the group gets larger. He has this nice funny quote in there. He says, look, 9 women can't have a baby in 1 month, no matter how well they coordinate their efforts. Now, he's saying, look, large teams, that happens at the ends of projects, you really have a trouble getting everybody to agree. If you think about an accessibility project and getting accessibility into this product, when you've got 30 people in the room, all of whom have to agree, well, how likely is that at the end when there's competing interests of we absolutely need to ship this, even though, yeah, it's not keyboard accessible. We'll deal with that later, that type of mentality. So his solution that he proposes is relentlessly limit the number of people allowed to thrash, and then appoint one person, a linchpin, to run it, someone who is good with their generosity and their humanity and that type of thing. And he's very clear, it needs to be just one person to make those decisions. And that linchpin is not you. It's not that you're gonna, remember, you're the one helping people through it. You're not the one to actually make the changes. Finally, number 8, the storytelling problem. This is a quote from Malcolm Gladwell in the book Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. He says, look, we have, as human beings, a storytelling problem. We're a bit too quick to come up with explanations for things that we really don't have an explanation for. Well, if you're like me, you may have encountered this. in your conversations with friends, family, and colleagues. And they say, well, what is it that you do? And you talk about, well, I work in accessibility, and we're trying to work on universal design. We're trying to change the way mainstream products are made so that they are accessible to everybody. And people would say, oh, well, I bet that costs a lot. And I think that would probably make your product look kind of crazy, and the manufacturers wouldn't want to do that type of thing. And besides, most manufacturers don't think that people with disabilities are their demographic, do they? And people would come up with all these sorts of explanations very quickly. And Gladwell is basically saying, that's what we do generally. When we can't explain something, we are very quick to come up with some sort of rationale in our head for why things are the way that they are. So this is closely tied to what we were talking about earlier in terms of miscalibration. But it says that this sort of thing goes on all the time. Now, why is this important? I'm going to bring up a series of studies that was done in the late 1990s, where previously in the 1980s, the academic field had worked on assistive technologies. So building new screen readers, building new screen magnifiers, building braille displays, that sort of thing. A great deal of activity happened in the 1980s. Then in the 1990s, there was the emergence of this field of universal design, where the idea is that regular products that can be purchased in Best Buy and big box stores, that those could be accessible, that ATMs and kiosks could be accessible. So I was part of that research team back then, working in this field, and we were going to a lot of conferences. We were doing a lot of exposure of the ideas, those books and papers and videos explaining the concept. But at the end of the 1990s, it just really wasn't being done by industry. There wasn't a sea change at all. So there was a survey. There was 4 different surveys that done, and this is from this list of responses here is from a meta-analysis that I did of the 4 studies. It's covered in the second chapter of my thesis. The link will be on the thing that I send out. But basically, so here I've got a surveyor, and this is sort of a tongue-in-cheek paraphrasing of the questions. The questions that were put out was basically saying, look, universal design is a cool thing to do and will help people with disabilities greatly. So why don't you do it? And the respondent has to think for a minute, and the respondent comes back with, does it cost a lot? And then the surveyor writes that down and wrote down a long list of these types of issues. Well, I think that this is really an example of this storytelling problem. That if you're asking somebody who doesn't do something why they don't do something, they have to come up with a reason on the fly. And it sounds good. Universal design does sound good, but we're not doing it. What's the reason? Well, we have to invent a story for that. And I think that you end up with this sort of list of things that a lot of people then started to go work on in the accessibility field. For example, there was a lot of work on cost justifying usability. There were reports on creating a new marketplace for accessibility that came out of big think tanks, that type of thing. So, but solving these individual issues it doesn't really solve your bigger issue of overcoming resistance. So, for example, you've cost justified it, but then when you come to the actual development team, if you haven't solved those issues of resistance, then you're not going to get these list items checked off to justify why you're doing an accessibility project across this organization. And so those types of responses of the people that are quick to come up with a reason, it's certainly not a case of jotting it down and saying, well, that's the reason why we have why we're having resistance here, why we've got resistance to change. Instead, what you have to do is to learn about the way that the things work in that organization is that you need to help the story along as an interviewer. So it's a key thing for doing an organization-wide change project, as we've said, is to learn what's going on, learn what people say, learn what people do. Now, it's a common refrain in when directors talk about movie making that you need to do things to help the story along. And the story does not come from the interviewee. The story is generated by the interviewee and the interviewer together. They create what the story is. So there's, in social science research, there's talk about this myth that people mistakenly come in with, this idea that there's an answer just waiting somewhere behind the interviewee's eyes, and if only we could ask the right questions, we could get the truth to come out. The story is not the truth, and the questions that you choose dictate what the story is, because based on those responses, you change the next question. So it's really a collaborative exercise of coming up with a version of the story. And there's also this thing inside social science that there really isn't any such thing as the truth that you can pin down. It's really just opinions. It's really just people's self-interest that you're looking for. And whether that's true or not, whether their perceptions are based on truth or not, it's really irrelevant. What you really want is the story and to understand what's going on. So in those previous studies, the questions were, why don't you do universal design? Well, does that really build a good story? I personally didn't think so. So when I did my research on businesses, I basically went in with a question, when accessibility issues come up, what is it that you do? And I tried to learn from the things that they do. So there wasn't an implication that you're not doing something that's good, why not? Which puts them on the defensive. You're just saying, okay, what happens in your organization when accessibility issues arise? So you can use that sort of same technique. I would say that you really got to ask, don't focus on asking questions about your project, ask about things that may or may not impact their projects. So returning again to this issue of enlightened self-interest. So wrapping up some of this stuff and bringing it back to a practical suggestion, I think that the most important practical suggestion is to make accessibility a shared responsibility in the organization. And a number of other authors agree on that in these other resources. So I wanted to give a quote from my research. This is where I was interviewing somebody at a large organization, and they were doing very well on changing their organizational culture. And so I asked, what is it that you did? And she said, look, we went up to the executives, we went up to the board, and this is what she said. She said, of course, they didn't know about disability access either. They didn't know about the technical standards. And basically I said to them, there's only one thing you need to do. It's easy. Every time something comes across your desk from any person, you just ask, what access issues have been included in this project? Or have you included access features? And if not, can you go away and think about them? So in this situation, she's really absolving the executives of having to know anything about accessibility. But she does want the executives to know that of their customer base, 15 to 20% of people have disabilities. So if somebody comes to them with a project and they say to the person higher up than them, oh no, on this project it's really not an issue. Accessibility is really not an issue on this. I don't think we need to deal with that. But the executive is then going to say, no, we have people with disabilities. You should be working on your issues and your end users have disabilities. You need to go away and figure out what you need to do. And we have an accessibility office, a subject matter expert. You can go and ask for help on what it is that you're supposed to be doing. And she said that this key change was the main thing that really altered the tenor of accessibility throughout the organization. There were many other things, of course, but this was the key hook which caused the change to stick. So in many of the resources, you'll find that getting executive support for any project is like a cornerstone of any organization-wide approach. All of the resources basically say that, look, you know, you need to get the higher-ups to agree to your project, and then you need to disperse that throughout the organization. Now, the executive is most likely to be your buyer. So your buyer is the person that can say yes as well as no. So the buyer has agreed to bring you on as a consultant, and the buyer is the person, therefore, who can say yes, we're going to cut a check to this consultant. Most people within organizations can only say no. So you say, look, we want to implement this accessibility change, and they say no, because they know that they can say no. They can't say yes. The executives can say yes, and the executives can be behind you. So once you've got agreed plans with your buyer at the executive level, you need to go back to those agreed plans when your project starts to derail. But you've also got to remember what you learned about who appears to be in control, and you need to walk that fine line between those things. So how do you implement this idea of shared responsibility? So besides that that change in interaction that I described between the executives, the board, and their subordinates, you really need to do, I think, three key things. First is address the unfunded mandate fallacy. So you remember on that list of the Universal Design Survey answers, the first answer is always cost. It costs too much. So there's this phrase that goes around certainly in the Section 508 area that Section 508 was an unfunded mandate. That there should have been this pool of money that rained down from the sky to help these teams do the extra work of making products accessible. Well, that's a complete fallacy. If you look at it from the point of view of any project should be working for its end users, the end users include people with disabilities, then you say, look, for the last 15 years, maybe, you have managed to have this bonus money in your account that was supposed to be covering the needs of people with disabilities. But for the last 15 years, maybe you haven't been doing accessibility. So we're not asking you to do anything extra. We're asking you to do what should have been done all along. This wasn't an unfunded mandate. You have money in your account to deal with making things for your end users. So addressing that and saying, look, it's not our responsibility as the accessibility department to be making things accessible. It's your responsibility. And as such, you should be paying for it. Jeff Klein talks a lot about this in his book in terms of when you're starting out in this area, you might start taxing the various departments if they are not dealing with accessibility, and you start taxing them so that you can then go back to them and start educating them and taking it on board themselves. So that's addressing that. Then the next thing is including accessibility and performance indicators. That organization that I talked about, where they changed the dynamic, they also put it on performance indicators. And so everybody knew that if they came to their superiors and said, oh, in this project, accessibility is not such a big deal, and we don't need to deal with it, that they would get marked down on their performance indicators, their performance review for the year. And this then got really into their enlightened self-interest because that affected the way that they got paid and their opportunities for advancement. So you need to treat it like so many other things, so many other performance indicators that are real and have consequences, and therefore then it becomes in everybody's key interest. So, but in order to do this, you do need to provide these additional sources of expertise. That is either the accessibility program office who work in a sort of QA and support role, or the external contractor who's on retainer, who's there to help, because some issues are going to be beyond the capabilities of teams to effectively deal with a situation in accessibility that's outside the norm. And it's bound to happen. So you need to have that accessibility office, that subject matter experts on hand. It's a bit like fire safety. Everybody knows that they should hit the fire alarm and they know where the exit should be and where to gather, right? But that doesn't mean that they're all firefighters. So everybody needs a little bit of knowledge in order to do their work, but you need a fire marshal who's there to inspect and oversee that type of thing. So you can think of it like that way. So in summary, looking back at the learning objectives, we had inevitable resistance and planning ahead. We had identifying danger signs and getting back on track. And we had making accessibility a shared responsibility. So in part 2 of the talk, I was talking about the knowing and being able to see that these resistance things are going to be going on, and knowing them helps you figure out how to plan ahead, how to identify the danger signs, how to get back on track. For example, get back on track by appealing to rational self-interest. Get back on track by going back to the buyer and making sure that the original goals of a project are being respected. And if they're not, why? And so you've got to focus in terms of overcoming resistance. You've got to focus efforts differently as to whether you're talking to somebody at the executive level, the team level, or the individual level. You've really got to focus across all those. And I will include this list of subtopics on the email that gets sent with the reading list, and we'll provide links to those resources that I've mentioned today. So those subtopics, once again, were reduce ambiguity, avoid transition traps, keep returning to enlightened self-interest, coach the change makers, examine both aspects of culture, that is what people say and what people do, identify real sources of control, know what it means to ship, and you have to help the story along. You have to create the story with the people that you're helping and you're supporting and coaching. And then finally, make accessibility a shared responsibility. And one last summary slide here. My basic point is, if you have an environment in which people can make excuses, then people will make excuses. So remember the self-defense activities that Alan Cooper was talking about in his book. If people are being defensive, they will readily come up with lots of excuses as to why they shouldn't be doing what you want them to be doing. And shared responsibility has to become part of the culture. It's what people say, what people do. And this cycles back to the executives and that quote of all you need to do is, which I think is probably the key way that you can instigate change in an organization. And this last point here, so if you make it an environment where accessibility is part of everybody's shared responsibility and their performance is measured on it, then you really are making an environment where there is no excuse. Remember, you want people to have this in their enlightened self-interest. You want people to help lead it, and they will help lead it if it's in their self-interest. And that's the key. Well, thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand it back over to Natalie to handle any questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Chris. That was great. We do have a few more minutes left if anyone has any questions. I don't see any in the chat window, but please feel free to ask your questions in the chat window and we'll get those answered for you. So I'll give you just a minute or so.
Sure, and I'm putting up my contact details here on the PowerPoint file that you'll get. If you click the logo here, it will take you to my company website, which will tell you about my services. I'm happy to lend my services to team up on projects relating to organizational change for accessibility. Also, if you have any resources that you would like to share, anything that you found helpful in dealing with this topic area, I'd love to hear about it too. Please do send me a link to this email address, chrisandlaura@accessibilitytrack.com. You can send me that this afternoon, and then I will be sending out a reading list tomorrow afternoon. It'd be great to hear from you.
Okay, great. So we have a question. What is the best approach to working with a siloed company where the corporate culture doesn't allow you to interface with multiple teams?
Yeah, I have seen this before, and this goes back to the issue of who can say no, right? The silo culture is full of people who can say no. We don't want to work together. I worked for a long time in an accessibility department in a federal space that was. The accessibility department was next to the usability department, and on the organizational chart, they were under the same section. They were branches of the same tree. And the siloed culture was such that the usability department didn't even talk to the accessibility department. Never the twain should meet, except wandering past each other in the hallways. And so this type of thing happens quite a lot, yeah. We have in that situation, we have people who can say no. So I would suggest in that situation, understanding what's really going on is the key. First, really try to make sure, is this a silo culture? And you do that by interviewing, by talking, by listening, by going to lunch with people. And, is this really such a silo culture, or are there bridges here and there that you can build on? And if it's really happening, then you really do need to go back to your buyer and say, look, we have a problem here, and explain it as you see it, because your buyer, the CEO, may not even understand that there is a silent culture and may be very happy that you brought it up. So, yeah, tackle that one head on, but sort of step by step.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any other questions before we conclude?
Yeah, and I can always be reached, again, with this contact details. I can be reached offline if you have further questions about this topic, if you've got things to add about the topic, or you've got issues that you're looking to resolve.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Chris, I just want to thank you again for your wonderful webinar with us today. I would also like to thank TCS Interpreting for providing the closed captioning. Just a few reminders for everyone. I am putting up our feedback survey link. I'm going to give a shameless plug for all of you to go in and tell us your feedback on today's webinar. We would really like to get some good testimonials for this year. So I see some, lots of positive comments in the chat. So we'd appreciate any feedback. We also have our live webinar packages, which are now available with our registration page as well. Some upcoming webinars for 2016 for April, May, and June are up there. We also have our 2014 and 2015 webinar archives that are now on sale as well. So great. Wanted to thank Chris just one more time, and just to exit out of the webinar, simply just exit out of the room by closing the window on your screen and hang up the phone. Thanks so much, everyone.
And thank you, Natalie, for inviting us, and it was a great fun. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.